Welcome to the Psychedelic Passage podcast. My name is Jimmy Wynn. I am your host. Thanks for joining us this week. Really grateful to have you all here. And we have, I think, an episode that's going to be really helpful for folks. I know I say that every week, but as we develop our episodes, we're really tuning in to what we think is relevant in the moment, what we think is helpful for the psychedelic curious to hear. And as psychedelics emerge in our society and culture here in America, things are just moving so quickly. Things are evolving so quickly. If you look back over the past even 3 to 5 years, the level of psychedelic services was not as available as it was today. Especially if you zoom out 10 years or 15 years. And so as a part of the landscape changing so quickly, we try to find episodes that are relevant to the specific needs of what journeyers are navigating today. So today on this episode, we're going to be talking about what is the difference between psychedelic therapy and a broad term that I'll call psychedelic coaching, and what that means for you and how that's relevant if you are a psychedelic curious or a psychedelic journeyer. And so what we'll do is we will talk through a couple things. We'll talk about the psychedelic landscape and the emerging terminology in psychedelic related services. We'll talk about how that impacts you or anybody seeking intentional psychedelic use. We'll talk about our organization a little bit and our efforts to try to resolve this or try to provide, a thoughtful pathway towards this dynamic. And then we'll break down a little bit the actual difference between psychedelic therapy and psychedelic coaching. And so, I'll just first start by saying that the term psychedelic therapy or psychedelic assisted therapy has just become increasingly popular in our society. I think that this is a term that has really emerged over the past, again, 3 to 5 years. I think largely influenced by, clinical trials. There's, for example, the MAPS MDMA trial, which is seeking to not only federally deschedule MDMA, but what they are saying is that, hey, MDMA in conjunction with psychotherapy, traditional psychotherapy, is an effective treatment for PTSD and a certain variety of other mental health conditions. So that is awaiting stage 3 approval, which we'll find out here at the later end of 2024. And even if you search in Google, I think that psychedelic therapy or therapeutic psychedelic services becomes one of the larger search terms, one of the more popular, search terms. And so I'm just sharing that this phrase psychedelic therapy has been something that's a little bit new, for sure. And what I'd like to couple that with is that the psychedelic landscape as we see it in America today is also new. I say that with a grain of salt because I acknowledge, of course, that in our human history, likely we've had some sort of meaningful relationship with psychedelics for probably thousands and thousands of years. As it relates to, just being an average, I'm not sure what average means nowadays anymore, but as it relates to being an average citizen in the United States, likely, psychedelics didn't emerge in your awareness probably until the past 60 or 70 years ago. Short of indigenous cultures who have used these medicines as a sacrament in their, traditions and rituals, psilocybin mushrooms weren't really even introduced into the United States until about the 1960s. And I urge anybody who is interested in hearing more about that to just look up the name Maria Sabina. I think that is a really, really important name as far as the lineage of psilocybin work here in the United States. And so as we're approaching modern times, I think for many folks, it's easy to think that psychedelic services are standardized, but it's really not. Like I don't think it can barely be called an industry. An industry notes that there's oversight and governance and standards and protocols, and we are certainly probably in a stage that is pre-industry, meaning that there are not real tangible formalized pathways for an individual to get treatment or to engage in services that are psychedelic related. So by extension of that, what that means is no one can really currently claim that any particular psychedelic substance can be used to directly treat a mental health condition like anxiety, depression, or PTSD. That's why the MDMA trial, by MAPS and Lykos Therapeutics, is even going through the trouble of trying to seek FDA approval. What that creates, though, is that there's a lot of people seeking psychedelic use for mental health related conditions. And so, though there's evidence, there's certainly efficacy. I personally believe that psychedelics can greatly support and improve the life conditions of, individuals suffering. We at Psychedelic Passage believe this for sure. But, this slight nuance can create a lot of confusion, especially for folks who are out there looking for services today, right? Like, imagine you've been suffering for quite some time. You feel like you've tried everything available to you in the realm of mental health and medical support. And then you hear about this potential, healing property of psychedelics, and then you are seeking it, but then there's no real pathway for you to go about, doing that. So what that means is that there's plenty of folks, plenty of well-intentioned folks across a wide variety of needs and backgrounds that are seeking these services. And so to put this a little bit further into perspective is that the terminology around how we speak about, I think, just healing and alternative forms of therapeutic use of substances like psychedelics can also impact this conversation. So I'm just taking some time here to just set up a little bit of like a primer for us so that we can move through the dialogue of the rest of our content here today. And so it's a new industry, new-ish, I guess. And also the phrasing and the terminology that we're using around all of this is new. So I'll even zoom out of the psychedelic space just to say that there are just certain terms that are just newer in general. Like, I feel like holistic health only recently became a term over the past couple of decades, or holistic, wellness. I think that alternative, medicine or alternative, options of medicine, it has become more of a socially accepted thing over the past, period of time. What I think is interesting is even in our Western society, when we were regarding, indigenous practices, I think before our recent time, before shaman this and shaman that started showing up, we were using the term, witch doctor, which was quite fascinating. And so my point here is that the terminology and the way that we view these services and the way that we view just intentionally using psychedelics at large is greatly influenced by our culture and what becomes commonly known language in the mainstream, right? And I kind of joke about, when I say shaman this and shaman that, because I think that for many folks, they're using the word shaman as a catch-all term for a more, let's say, potentially spiritually oriented psychedelic or healing experience. I think the word shaman becomes a catch-all term for holistic health in general. Something that I saw on Instagram the other day. It was this AI post that had this AI imagery of what was supposedly like a Native American person in a headdress, and it was like, "Are you being called to the shamanic path? Are you a healer? Are you here to help the world?" And then you scroll down and it says, "Take this 8-week course and blah blah blah, and then you'll be a certified shaman, and I'm like, what does that even mean? And I bring that up to say that the way that we have, used the word shaman as this catch-all term, I think we've done the same with psychedelic therapy. And so what that means is that there's plenty of people who will claim to be XYZ, claim to be a shaman, claim to be a therapist, when, I think there's a lot of ambiguity on what that actually means. And I also think that the terminology is for sure, very limiting. And what I'll say here is that even in Colorado, there's a really fascinating thing going on. So as most folks know, if you've listened to these episodes, that in Colorado there was a provision, Proposition 122, that was passed, which basically paved the way for a regulated a system of engaging in psilocybin related services, or services that were related to natural medicines, which was a classification of, natural psychedelics that could be used for therapeutic use. Also, this provision or proposition had paved the way for communal use of psychedelics, which we greatly exercise and support in Colorado, where an individual can be gifted psilocybin mushrooms, and then also in conjunction with that, pay an individual for bona fide support services and harm reduction services. So the funny thing is that now we were reading some of the new rules, and now Colorado is limiting the term psychedelic facilitator. What that means now is that people cannot use the term psychedelic facilitator in Colorado, because the state is denoting and saying that, okay, that now means that you have some sort of formal licensure for practicing in psychedelics, which is emerging. These things are coming up. Oregon is a state where this is happening. Colorado is also a state where this is happening. Where I find a lot of issue here is that there have actually been many practitioners, many folks who have been working in, the legacy space, people who have risked their neck and their safety to support folks through psychedelic experiences over the past 50, 60 years. Folks who are generally unlicensed, maybe folks of varying backgrounds, maybe some were mental health professionals, maybe some weren't, maybe some were really good at what they do, maybe some weren't, right? But the point is that the way that we have been engaging with psychedelics in a meaningful way has certainly been going on for many, many decades before any of these regulations are happening. And I think that for a time it was really difficult, to determine, okay, well, what do I call myself if I'm a person providing these services? Well, trip sitter was a term for quite a bit of time, but if you look at this body of work, it's a little bit more than just sitting with you while you're tripping on a psychedelic substance. There's certainly preparation and integration and a range of coaching services, a range of support services. And so over the past, I'd say, decade or so, I think many folks in the legacy market have been working really hard to call themselves a facilitator. I'm a psychedelic facilitator. I facilitate meaningful and intentional psychedelic experiences. And that's a little bit different than a psychedelic guide, right? That's another question. Like, why is psychedelic guide a popular term? And why is that more or less favorable than psychedelic facilitator, as an example, right? So these are all things that are up for debate and up for discussion. So now Colorado comes in and they say, hey, we're one of the regulated markets. Thank you so much for doing all of the work for standardizing and normalizing terminology around this body of work that did not exist prior to that. We will now take that and we will now claim that language, and now that language is ours. So in a way, I will directly say that, this regulated program is almost like colonizing the term psychedelic facilitator off of the backs of people who had been risking their professional standing, who have been risking breaking the law because they believed that psychedelics was helping and supporting folks in a meaningful way. So now a regulated, system comes in and says, no, actually, that's our term now. You now no longer can use that. And so obviously, you're hearing me be a little bit passionate in this here. But I just want to share with you that it's a strong example of how things will shift and change quite a bit in the psychedelic space. And so I don't want people to think that just because there's terminology that's used today, just because there's commonly used language today, that actually has any reflection on on what that actually means if you're out there looking for a service provider, right? So what I'll share is that psychedelic assisted psychotherapy currently doesn't exist in America. What I mean by saying that psychedelic assisted psychotherapy currently doesn't exist is that you're not able to go out today and find an individual who practices in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, and expect to receive the same benefits and perks and services of traditional talk therapy, let's say. Sure, there are clinical trials and studies for sure. Many of them involve psychotherapy or talk therapy, but there's actually no approval yet. And so we expect, here at Psychedelic Passage for psychedelic assisted psychotherapy to be formalized over the next decade. And at the same time, there's been this term psychedelic assisted therapy, PAT, which you see Oregon using in their program. And so you can already see that this creates a lot of confusion. Now, there's certainly some precursors in building that pathway towards psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. So, ketamine clinics where you're maybe doing an at-home program or a ketamine infusion program sometimes includes psychotherapy, sometimes includes prep and integration. And, that's now being touted as psychedelic therapy, but I'm a little wary of that because of the wide range of standards and honestly the number of horror stories that I hear from people who have gotten insufficient care when they're working with the powerful substance like ketamine. And then if you've heard me mention the Oregon program, which you become a licensed facilitator by, I believe, doing somewhere I think 140 or maybe 260 hours through a training program. And there's a lot of individuals who are facilitators or service providers in Oregon who are also claiming to be mental health professionals and therapists, just because they went through that state mandated, training. And so I'm just highlighting that, if I was a person who is new to psychedelics and I was really trying to explore this, it becomes really confusing if I don't know the difference between psychedelic assisted therapy versus psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. And then this whole conversation about who's allowed, I'm using air quotes here if anybody's, watching the video, of who's allowed or not allowed to practice it in this work, right? So what ends up happening is that psychedelic assisted therapy has become an umbrella term that encompasses a lot of different approaches, modalities, and licensure. And then I think the other thing too is that in conjunction with this being a newer industry, it creates a lot of gray space. So like think about the massage industry for a moment, right? Like the massage industry is pretty fairly regulated for the most part. People use the term massage therapy, which likely means that you went through some type of massage school or got some type of massage certification. You likely have some different type of modality or skill set in massage. Some people will go a little bit further and maybe combine that with like functional medicines, physical therapy, things like that. And then there's this terminology, massage therapist. Well, there's not many people who would confuse a massage therapist with, let's say, a a marriage and family therapist, an MFT who practices psychotherapy. So you can see how a developed industry can create standards and norms so that we don't have confusion in this space. But with the absence of that in the psychedelic space today, this creates a lot of ambiguity. This creates a lot of gray space, and it can be confusing what service providers actually do and actually provide. So people will make a lot of different claims and generally go unchecked, which can certainly put you, at worst, can put you at great risk. and at best is something for you to consider as you are seeking a professional in psychedelic related services. And I'll just share that this issue is not just isolated to psychedelic work. There's a whole world of spiritual wellness, holistic wellness influencers that float around online who are, selling products and services and supplements and nootropics and claim, certain claims about their product and service that because it's become so quickly developed over the past, 10 years or so, there's actually not a lot of regulation around that. And so, what I want to share with you is that not all folks who will claim to be, let's say, an integration therapist, I hear that one all the time, or I'm a psychedelic therapist, or I'm a practitioner that practices in psychedelic therapy. Well, not all of those are actually licensed mental health professionals. And you may or may not be seeking a licensed mental health professional, but I think that's really important. An individual will go through an IFS certification, internal family systems. This is something that I believe has been very complementary and very helpful to folks as a modality that is adjacent to psychedelic work. And then you go through a training course, maybe you do level 1 IFS, which, I don't know the number of hours and requirements there, but certainly it's not the 3,000 hours required to become, an MFT. Uh, and then all of a sudden folks come out of an IFS training course and they're like, well, I'm an IFS trained therapist. Or folks will go through the MAPS MDMA training, and then they'll all of a sudden say, "Well, I'm a clinically trained psychedelic therapist now." You know what I mean? So I think what I'm sharing here is that people are taking advantage of this ambiguity. And I think that, just a certain disclaimer here is that if a licensed mental health professional directly supplies you with the psychedelic medicine and is your sitter and practitioner during a psychedelic experience, I want to be very clear that they are not operating in the capacity of a licensed mental health professional. Because most of those folks, if they were breaking the law to provide you services, would stand to potentially have their license in review, or could be committing malpractice, or could be, at risk of losing their license, right? Now, I'll create a distinction here to say that there certainly are psychedelic practitioners with mental health backgrounds who may also choose to serve as your practitioner or coach or your facilitator, right? And this then speaks, homage to the people who have been doing this therapeutic psychedelic work, this psychedelics oriented for healing work over the past, many, many decades here. And so, what does this all mean? Well, we here at Psychedelic Passage know that there's people out here who are seeking therapeutic psychedelic services today. That's a part of why we exist. Back in 2018, Michael Pollan's book "How to Change Your Mind" came out, which really broke down a lot of the stigma around psychedelic use, and then we saw a flood of individuals who are now new to psychedelics or didn't experience psychedelics before and are now seeking, services. So we wanted to do something for those folks that can directly help their safety and increase their impact. So instead of waiting for decades for things to formalize, we at Psychedelic Passage became a self-regulated community that sets our own standards, sets our own ethical practices, and that's today the building blocks of our referral network of psychedelic practitioners who have a range of different backgrounds and practices. Some lean more mental health oriented for sure. Some lean more, holistic for sure. And so, what I want to share here is that, we're talking about the difference between psychedelic therapy and psychedelic coaching. The major difference here is that this all depends on your order of care. And what is important is that your practitioner is clear and transparent and doesn't work out of their scope. Oftentimes, what that means is that you have to be an individual who knows how to ask the right questions so that you can determine and be your best advocate on your care. So, if you were, let's say, seeking psychedelics directly for a mental health condition, it's important for you to know that likely you're not going to find a practitioner that says, yes, I can treat this mental health condition with psychedelics. And by the way, it's covered by insurance and, so on and so forth. It just doesn't work like that nowadays. Now you can maybe seek a psychedelic, practitioner who says, well, I am mental health informed. I've certainly worked with folks who have been dealing with the same mental health conditions as you have. I'm not a licensed mental health professional. I want to be really clear on that. And then I think with that level of baseline, you can create a pathway to see, okay, is this person the right fit for me? And open up a dialogue for that. So in lieu of formal psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, what I believe the best option is for a psychedelic specialist, which I will coin this. I'm not going to coin this term. I'm not coining anything, but what I'll say is that as a part of using these catch-all terms, shaman, psychedelic therapist, I think it's also important to use another catch-all term, which I would frame up as a psychedelic coach, right? And so my stance is that in lieu of formal psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, I think the best option is for a psychedelic specialist, a coach, a practitioner to work in conjunction with a traditional psychotherapist. So what I'm saying here is that psychedelics can be an adjunct, psychedelics can be complementary to psychotherapy, but certainly they are not a replacement, for each other. And I'll acknowledge here that we're kind of creating our own terminology here too. And just the same way that we used to use the term facilitator before it got colonized, I think orienting around the phrasing psychedelic practitioner and psychedelic coach can be a way to help to clear up a lot of this gray space, a lot of this ambiguity in which people can make false claims and work out of their scope. And so what is a psychedelic practitioner or a psychedelic coach? Well, this could be for microdosing. This could be for a large dose experience. It's likely more than just an integration specialist. It's probably somebody who will provide some type of direct in-person support during a psychedelic experience. And then somebody who is also providing a level of coaching. And likely this individual will also take you through all of the components of therapeutic psychedelic work, pre-screening, onboarding, the preparation process, the ceremony or dosing session, integration, ongoing coaching, and beyond. And so if someone is seeking psychedelic therapy, aka a more mental health oriented psychedelic approach, I think the most ideal is that they work with a licensed mental health professional who is psychedelic knowledgeable, or at a minimum psychedelic friendly, or has, psychotherapy modalities that are complementary to psychedelic, work. I'm particularly a fan of, IFS, as I mentioned, parts work, more Jungian oriented, therapists. That's just, me personally, but certainly DBT, CBT can be certainly helpful for certain folks. There's just a wide range of therapeutic modalities, psychotherapy modalities that I think can be helpful in conjunction with psychedelics. And then also they should work with a psychedelic specialist or a psychedelic coach, like the ones that are found in our referral network. So this leads to a question on, I think every single psychedelic practitioner or psychedelic coach out there needs to really discern what's in their scope or what's not in their scope. And it shouldn't be up to the journeyer. It shouldn't be up to the psychedelic curious to be able to tease that apart. It should be the practitioner. It should be the coach. It should be the facilitator who is making that clear for the journeyer so that they can have their best informed consent and advocate for their care and for their needs. So a practitioner or coach is clear that they're not operating in the capacity of mental health, and they're not providing psychotherapy services. I think that's important. So what are some key differences here? So some key differences between a psychotherapist versus a psychedelic coach. I'll just list off a couple of things that a psychotherapist does. They probably have some sort of formal mental health licensure. This can be MSWs, LPCs, MFTs, psychiatrists, practicing psychologists. Most of these folks have gone through school. They've gone through a certain number of accreditation hours. They've gone through some type of a supervisory process. There is some type of regulatory or governing board there. They can practice in certain states and not practice in certain states, depending on their licensure. And they have to go on for continuing education or CEs. Some of these individuals may be able to diagnose formal mental health conditions. Some may be able to prescribe medication like psychiatrists, but even the people who can prescribe right now, they cannot prescribe you psychedelic substances. This is a really clear distinction here in 2024. Psychotherapy, so like therapy sessions may be covered by insurance. Psychotherapists, as I mentioned before, typically work within some commonly accepted psychotherapy modalities. So this is an easy, list to Google. The one that I'll point out is EMDR, which is a an eye movement tracking process that can help folks to source and release trauma. I think has been one that's been pretty fascinating over the past, 20 years that I think many folks find to be supportive with psychedelic services. And therefore, they have to comply with a certain level of legal practices and standards, as well as ethical requirements. Psychotherapists likely will be more neutral in their approach to your care, typically have a little bit of a I call it like a buffer space or like a distance space between their own personal lives and you. I think a good psychotherapist is not sharing very much about their personal lives. And the reason around this is that there should and are strict boundaries around dual relationships, personal versus professional. So, for instance, if you were a patient that was, getting treatment from a licensed psychotherapist, likely you're not going to be able to go out and have dinner with them on a random, Friday night. And so there is this concept of dual relationship and the ethical standards that are upheld there. However, it's important to note that there are plenty of licensed mental health professionals out there who break these ethical and legal rules. There's certainly therapists who abuse their patients and clients. There's certainly therapists who cross ethical boundaries, personal boundaries, and a lot of different boundaries of that nature. So when we think about facilitator abuse or a practitioner abuse, that is not something that is just specific to the psychedelic landscape, right? And then I think a psychotherapist probably has some limitations on the ancillary services and treatment modalities that they can provide. And then again, I'll share as it stands right now in 2024, if a psychotherapist supplies you the psychedelic substance, they are likely operating illegally. I'm not casting any judgment on that from an ethical standpoint. I think that there are many folks who work in the legacy, space and the underground space who I think do an amazing job. And I also think that there are folks who you should proceed with in caution. And really, it's up to you. A lot of what I'm sharing here is about empowering you as an individual so you can make the right choice, right? So how does that differ compared to a psychedelic coach? Okay, so since psychedelic therapy is a catch-all umbrella term, we're going to use psychedelic coach as a catch-all umbrella term, and I think that is safer and more relevant. So they may or may not have direct psychedelic related licensure. As you know, only the state of Oregon and Colorado, soon to be, will have formal psychedelic related licensure. They probably will have a wide variety of background, approaches, and modalities. Maybe some of these psychedelic coaches lean more into indigenous and lineage, related medicine work. Some folks come from a harm reductionist background. Some folks are oriented towards holistic health and healing. Some folks are academic. Some folks are religiously oriented, may lead a psychedelic church. Some are more spiritually oriented. some are coaches. So, I'm certainly thinking about all of the various backgrounds of the individuals that we have in our referral network, because we believe that you should have a choice if you're psychedelic curious and choosing who the right person is to care for you. These psychedelic coaches, you may find them specializing in certain things. So some folks do integration only. Some folks focus on preparation. Some folks focus on, medication and tapering. Some folks focus on microdosing. I find that the best psychedelic practitioner or psychedelic coach is probably someone who can do it all, somebody who can walk you from, step one all the way through to integrating a meaningful psychedelic experience. The interesting thing with psychedelic coaches is that they probably have a little bit more freedom in offering suggestions and recommendations to various other therapeutic practices like meditation, mindfulness, breath work, various types of body work and physical therapy, and other holistic options that maybe a psychotherapist could recommend, but probably couldn't give you like a formal, a pathway to say, yes, this will help you in doing this. I think that a good psychedelic coach is also trauma informed and body informed. I think that a good psychedelic coach will also have a general knowledge and experience with mental and emotional states. But I think in wrapping up this episode, what I want to share is that it's just important that psychedelic professionals get honest about their distinctions. And what I see out there is many folks are claiming to be a therapist when they shouldn't. And I think that there is an honest ethical choice on, if you're a psychedelic practitioner, oh, is this a person who is in a coaching realm? Or does this person actually need therapy in which I likely can't provide? That's probably out of my scope, especially when it comes with more dire mental health conditions that can affect somebody's, well-being and livelihood. And so that wraps up our episode today. I would love to hear what you think. I mean, certainly a lot of this is of my opinion and my thoughts and working in this direct, psychedelic coaching and practitioner space over the past half decade. What do you think? Am I right here? Am I wrong here? Should there be some type of a distinction between psychedelic therapy and psychedelic coaching? So you can find our episodes of this podcast really anywhere you get podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. We post clips of this onto our Instagram and social media, and then also YouTube. So anywhere you find a comment, I would love to hear what you think. If this episode has been helpful to you, I would urge you to check out our website, psychedelicpassage.com, where there's a massive amount of resources for the psychedelic curious. And one thing that we try to do here at Psychedelic Passage is help the psychedelic curious become psychedelic capable. And so sending out a lot of love to anybody who is exploring an intentional psychedelic experience. And I look forward to seeing you next time.